Boxing matches with MMA fighters never end well. I can't think of a single time a current or former MMA fighter was able to successfully transition into a boxing match against a boxer and win. Maybe Anderson Silva that one time, but then he fell victim to the GOAT. And speaking of, this past weekend at the time of this recording, Jake Paul yet again beat up an old out of prime MMA fighter, this time Nate Diaz, and obviously Nate's my boy, but what the hell was any of that? And we all saw this a mile away. Nate Diaz never stood a chance, and I think for most sports books, he was like a plus 300 underdog. And that goes for practically every MMA fighter going into boxing. Tyron Woodley, Ben Askren, and the aforementioned Anderson Silva met the same fate as Nate Diaz. Conor McGregor, though, did much better than anyone would have expected, especially in the early rounds, still got beat up and finished by an older Mayweather. And it seems like Francis Ngannou will probably meet the same fate as all those other guys with his fight against Tyson Fury if the rules remain the same and we stick to traditional boxing. But what if we don't stick to the rules? Can we make a fight that involves MMA fighters against boxers close and competitive? Now, I asked you guys in my community poll how we could solve this problem, and a majority of you guys are party poopers. A vast majority of you guys said that we shouldn't change the rules because we should stop paying for these fights and end this tomfoolery altogether. See, that's not a fun answer. Sometimes, even as a die-hard fight fan, I enjoy seeing these ridiculous fights, but the only thing is that I want them to be at least competitive. And I'm assuming you do too, because as it stands, the MMA fighter has no chance against the boxer. So instead of just saying we should end these fights, let's think of a solution as to how we could change these rules so MMA fighters have at least some sort of chance at winning, and we can make these ridiculous fights much more competitive and a little more fun. My first thought was to change the gloves they use to 4-ounce MMA gloves. To the uninitiated, you may think that the glove size doesn't matter because it's just boxing and it's just throwing punches, and it's all the same whether it's in MMA or traditional boxing, right? That's wrong. Because of the larger gloves, boxers fully utilize and benefit from such a large surface area, especially on the defensive end. So first, let's talk blocking. So traditionally in boxing, you're taught in a more orthodox guard to put your fist at your chin or in a high guard at the top of your temple, but in either case, the glove is big enough to cover a majority of your head. But with 4-ounce gloves, it's a different story. You can't get away with putting your hands in this position because the glove is simply too small to cover your head, and punches can often go around these small gloves. So blocking in MMA usually involves putting your arms up a little further to the point where you're blocking with your forearm and sometimes the meat of your bicep. This difference in gloves is why this high guard or last resort guard is pretty effective and for the most part safe in boxing, as you can protect your body because again, your elbows are low enough but your arms are still high enough to protect a majority of your head, and that's because of those larger gloves. In MMA, you can't be in this position all the time and it's not as safe as it is in boxing. In the UFC, most fighters will go for the clinch or takedown, and rarely is this position a comfortable position in MMA, but sometimes it can be. The bigger surface area also means boxers can take advantage of catching punches. With boxing gloves, boxers can face their palm outward and forward, catch a punch like a baseball, and throw something right back. I mean, technically nothing is really stopping MMA fighters from doing the exact same thing, but catching a punch with a 4-ounce glove just hurts, and we rarely see this technique in MMA because of this. Finally, gloves that can expose fingers can take advantage of, well, fingers. Taking grappling out of it, some MMA fighters simply like to stick out their fingers and stick out their arms, grab their opponent's arm in their guard and punch around it. That could be another dynamic use case of the MMA glove that could even out a fight in an MMA fighter's favor. And speaking of grabbing, let's talk clinching. I've explained my gripes with clinching in boxing here in this relatively older video of mine, but essentially in traditional boxing, referees don't allow boxers to punch or even work in the clinch, which sucks. I think the clinch in boxing slows down the pace of the matches by a lot and makes the referee step in way too much. Boxers should be allowed to punch in the clinch and be able to work out of the clinch on their own, and these clinches should only be broken up when the arms of both fighters cannot punch. For traditional boxing, that keeps the pace of the fight going, but in these matches we're talking about in particular, this allows MMA fighters to work another aspect of fighting that boxers do not train, and MMA fighters could control a boxer in these clinch positions and throw some nice uppercuts and close hooks to even the score. Then there's an interesting rule I saw in the comments, which was allowing all punches in these matches. So this would include hammer fists, spinning back fists, backhands, etc., etc. And this idea of allowing all punches has actually been done before. Back in 2021, Triller decided to introduce the concept of Triad combat, which was an attempt to mix boxing with MMA by allowing all punches, which included spinning back fists, hammer punches, and all the other punches that are included in MMA. And as I was watching Triad combat and writing the script, I also noticed that referees allowed fighters to work in the clinch. And then I also noticed that they were working with 4-ounce MMA gloves. And then I realized, shit, this is not an original idea. This was done 2 years ago. I feel like I was writing a script to a movie that already has been made, but thankfully, not a lot of people have heard about this movie, and the sequel didn't get a lot of press, so I'm still releasing this video anyways. Onward, if we go into the actual Triad combat event, MMA fighters actually won a majority of the fights here and made for at least one entertaining fight in Mike Perry versus Michael Seals, and though Mike Perry got dropped, he still made this fight close and actually got the win at the end of the fight. Matt Mitrione also landed one of the only spinning back fists in the Triad fights that I could find on YouTube. But anyways, watching this event, besides pissing me off that my entire video has already been done before, at least validated my ideas, as it did make these fights between MMA fighters and boxers close, and I think if executed with bigger personalities like Jake Paul and MMA fighters, or Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury, it could set a precedent for these type of fights to at least have some rule changes to make it even against MMA fighters and traditional boxers. And I would also like to add that I don't think MMA fighters in the Triad combat completely took advantage of the new rule set. Most MMA fighters in Triad didn't throw the added punches like spinning back fists or hammer fists all too much. MMA fighters, I don't even think, considered extending their arms and grabbing their opponent's guard. And MMA fighters here in Triad didn't really abuse the clinch as much as I would have thought. So even though this new rule set has been done before, I think MMA fighters are yet to take full advantage of these rules. And as we near the end of this video, you still might think that trying to come up with a rule set to make these fights fair is still silly, because these fights are silly and shouldn't be watched. But they're inevitable because they bring in so much money. Ever since Mayweather versus Conor, people want to see a clash of personalities and the spectacle of the fight. And if you're a UFC fan and you think this is ridiculous, think about it like this. For a majority of these fighters, fighting a guy like Jake Paul is their biggest paycheck. I'm happy to see guys like Nate Diaz, Anderson Silva, Tyron Woodley, hell, even Ben Askren to get some of the biggest single paychecks in their life, especially in the tail end of their career when they deserve it. And this may be a little far-fetched equivalency, but when ONE FC mixed up their rules and made Mighty Mouse versus Rodtang possible, it made for a kind of competitive and ultimately really fun fight for everyone to enjoy. So I do think mixing up the rules just enough to make these crazy fights a little more crazy can also make them a little more competitive. So with these UFC fighters continuing to get big paychecks, the demand of these freak show fights to continue to happen, and the potential of making fights competitive under mixed rules, we might as well try to think of ways that we can improve the rule set and make it enjoyable for everybody. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. Let me know your thoughts on these type of fights and how we can make them competitive, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.